Okay, integrating sources into your essay. There's 3 ways that you can do this: summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. To summarize, you're taking a source and restating its ideas in fewer words than the original. When you paraphrase a source, you're restating a short passage in your own words, and it's about the same size as the original passage. When you quote a source, you're using its exact language with quotation marks or in a block quotation. You would use a block quotation if the quotation was more than 4 lines. So here's summarizing. Summarizing you would do when you're condensing a version of an author's key points from a larger work. It could be fiction or nonfiction. You use summarizing in order to describe numerical data or statistics. And you would also summarize any information from others that you're putting into your own words. And when do you do summary? Well, you would use it to provide a context for your argument or to provide background on an issue. Summary also comes in handy to provide an overview of somebody else's point of view or for assistance in framing and clarifying an issue or a perspective. Well, you would also use summary when a passage from a source is way too long to quote or to paraphrase. And summary comes in handy when you only want the main ideas out of a source, because only the main ideas might be relevant to your argument. Here are some examples of summary. This is not a very good one. See if you can see why this isn't a good example of summary. David Cizinco's article, "Don't Blame the Eater," is nothing more than an angry rant in which he accuses the fast food companies of an evil conspiracy to make people fat. So the reason that's not a good example is because it's not objective. It actually is more like a review, because you are criticizing, at least putting a value judgment on what David Cizinco's article said, because you're calling it an angry rant, nothing more than an angry rant. A summary has to be more objective, and that way it would carry more ethos. Here's a better example. Eudora Welty's A Worn Path concerns a very old woman who walks from the back country into the city, encountering a variety of obstacles on her trip in order to retrieve medicine for her chronically ill grandson. A Worn Path is a short story. This is a very succinct, brief, and perfect little summary about what that story is about. So summarizing is you're not just simply summarizing somebody else's point or primary source, but you're doing it in a way that it fits the agenda and moves your argument further. And the way you do that is through the selection of certain verbs that helps to clarify for your reader the intention of the author with his original source. For instance, you could say that the author is claiming or arguing or insisting or suggesting. You could also frame the summary in terms of the author endorsing or praising or agreeing or supporting. If the source that you're summarizing is in disagreement, some of the synonyms for that would be to contradict or complain or question, reject. And the fourth type of verb category for framing the author's intent of the summary would be to recommend, like to advocate, or the author demands or encourages or pleads or warns. Paraphrasing, the second way of having a source in your paper, is the art of restating a passage in your own words. You restate the source in your own words, including the main ideas and most of its details. Your paraphrase will be about the same length as the original passage, and it needs to sound more like you than your original source, which is why you're paraphrasing it. When do you paraphrase? Well, when a source's ideas or information are important to your argument, but not necessarily its language. You can also use paraphrasing to state the ideas of a source more clearly than what was stated in the original. Or when a source uses technical terms that might be unfamiliar to your readers. For instance, if their source is a highly technical article and you're writing an article for laymen, you might want to paraphrase it. And also you would paraphrase because you don't want to inundate your paper with too many quotations. Here's some examples of paraphrasing. The original source, it comes from The Sporting Spirit, which is an essay written by George Orwell. So the original source is written here as, "Serious sport has nothing to do with fair play. It's bound up with the hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it's war minus the shooting." So if you wanted to use that idea from Orwell in your argument, you could paraphrase it by saying, in his essay, The Sporting Spirit, George Orwell argues, there's that verb, that sport can be just as violent as war. The idea of fair play, he says, is for serious athletes only a myth. They feel the same hateful and violent feelings as do soldiers in combat. After that, we have a page number. That's called an in-text citation. It's in parentheses, 194, followed by the punctuation that designates the end of the sentence. Make sure that that comes after the in-text citation. You don't need to put in here that it's from George Orwell because you already cite that within the paragraph itself. So all I need would be the 194. Here's some other ways that you could integrate paraphrasing. You could say, in George Orwell's view, and then you would, recant what the source said. You could say, in his essay, The Sporting Spirit, George Orwell argues that, and then you would paraphrase what that original source said. And this third example, you're actually putting a little bit more of an understanding of the author's intent. When you say George Orwell understood the intensity of the professional athlete better than most when he explained that. Okay, that just gives a little bit more detail to where Orwell was coming from as an author when he wrote that. Okay, so here is another thing that you can do when you're paraphrasing, and it's important to give the reader something to go on. How are they going to judge this source that you're putting in there? Well, you can do it by stating their reputation. Sometimes I'll see a paraphrase by somebody and I don't know how to take it because I don't know who this person is. So you could say George Orwell, the famed author of 1984 and Animal Farm, has suggested that. And so that puts the author in perspective. You could also mention a publication's own perspective, like in a pamphlet intended for anti-government militia groups, Norman E. Olson argues that. And that, again, gives it context. So when I'm reading what that source says or a paraphrase of that source, I know where it's coming from. And it's also important for you to use a verb that reflects your own view of the source. And those are some of the views that if you say he refutes or he claims or argues or is passionate about, that is your ability as an author to put in your own sensibility in referencing the source's material. Quoting. That's the biggest one that most people use, but you really don't want to overuse it. And you don't specifically want to quote a source unless it's going to help your essay more than paraphrasing would. Because remember, paraphrasing is something that's in your own language and you have more control over it and how it's going to work towards proving your argument. Quoting is something that you have to set up the right way and you have to explain the right way and you have to make sure that the language in the quote doesn't contradict the style of your own language. So before you quote your source, you need to make sure that you're signaling that a quote is coming. And then you have to connect the quote into your sentence itself. And then you need to introduce your quote. So those are the three things that happen before you even get to a quote. Don't just start with a quote because the reader is like lost. He doesn't know what to do with the quote. When do you use it? Quotes. Well, the quoted words are your primary evidence. If that's true, you definitely have to quote it. It's when the passage raises an important objection that you want to refute or rebut, and you want to show that you're not misrepresenting or taking it out of context. It's important to make it word for word what you're criticizing or contesting. You would also quote when the words of a passage are so original or so strange or odd or otherwise just too useful for you to lose in a paraphrase. And you would also quote when a secondary source supports your claim and it's written by an important authority who's going to give your argument credibility. Here's some examples. You can quote a passage by using your own introductory phrase. You could say, Jared Diamond reminds us that, and then follows with the quote. Again, you have the in-text citation as a page number with the punctuation of the sentence following that, parentheses. You don't need to say Diamond because you've already told me Jared Diamond. You can also weave a quote into the makings of your own sentence by, for instance, when Thoreau argues that by simplifying one's life, the laws of the universe will appear less complex, he introduces an idea explored at length in his subsequent writings. You hardly notice that the quote is in there because it just flows. I know it's by Thoreau because you already set that up, and then you tell me what the intent of it is. So this is how you modify quotes. There's only two ways that you can change a quote, and that is through ellipses or through brackets. You use ellipses when you're deleting a section of the quote, and you would usually do that to condense it or because some of the words that are in the quote are extraneous to what you want to pull out. Here's an example from Thoreau again. Thoreau believes that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, He will live with the license of a higher order of beings. Those 3 ellipses, that indicates there's a lot more in there, and there was. It was just another list of stuff, but the focus of the sentence is how he will live with the license of a higher order of beings, and it's if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams. It works grammatically. When you lose an ellipse, when you use it, make sure that the grammatic structure still follows correctly. So you can also use brackets, and you use brackets when you're adding to a quote. And you would do this only in innocuous words, like for instance, articles like the, or if you need to change a pronoun. Maybe it was referenced as a pronoun, but you need to put the person's name in it. So you might be able to do something like that to make it clearer for the reader. You're not doing anything that would change the meaning or intent of the passage. So in this case here, in addition to 5 areas where food production is how it was originally written, and this author wants to say in addition to the 5 areas where food production. And again, added there are in brackets because the author felt that it was clearer for the reader than to just go to for other. So this is what I call the sandwich. It's a good way to remember what you need to do when you're bringing a quote into your paper. These are intros and outros. You have to think of it in terms of you have a top piece of bread, a bottom piece of bread, and in between would be your sandwich, which is either meat or vegetarian. It doesn't matter what the filler is. So you need to introduce it. Top piece of bread. Use a single phrase and a reporting verb. In her newest report, Robin Lakoff argues that. Then would come the interior of the sandwich, and that's your quote. Cultural bias is built into the language. Your bottom piece of bread, you need to explain it. How does it connect with your thesis or the topic of your paragraph? Don't leave that bottom piece of bread out or the sandwich will fall apart. The reader will not be able to pick it up and eat it. Okay, so here's a fully written example. In her newest report, Robin Lakoff argues that cultural bias is built into the language because parents don't realize that they're actively codifying gender roles for their children. When referencing a daughter in a favorable light, a father would call her beautiful, and when referring to a son, he would say he was smart or business savvy. This message gets through on a subconscious and even conscious level. So here are some more examples. This is another one. So you will see here the sandwich. The top bar is my top piece of bread. The second is the quote, and then the third would be the bottom piece of bread. So in introducing it, this student wrote, "There's another way in which inequality damages us. It corrupts our politics. Well, if there are men in this country big enough to own the government of the United States," said Woodrow Wilson in 1913, "they are going to own it." Well, now there are, and they do. Well, not completely, of course, but hardly a week goes by without the disclosure of a case in which the influence of money has grotesquely distorted U.S. government policy. You see how that bottom piece of bread is so important in integrating what that quote even means, okay, in the context especially of your argument. Here's another example of an intro, a quote, and an outro. This is a quote that was written by Jeanette Winterson, who is a fiction writer. She resides in England. She does magical realism. If you like that kind of fiction, I would recommend her. She's kind of odd, but fun. So Winterson makes the point that everything about life is an illusion. Time, place, love, truth, and even our relationships. The most solid of things and the most real, the best beloved and the well-known, are only hand shadows on the wall, she writes. But this is difficult for the reader to assimilate. It's not unusual for an author to say that truth is subjective, but to say that nothing is true calls attention to the fact that what we are reading is also a shadow on the wall, and it carries no truth. That's kind of an interesting paragraph, isn't it? It's a little dense. You might want to read that again. So it's basically saying that everything is an illusion. Well, if everything is illusion, so is this that I am reading an illusion, and this isn't truth either. So I am stuck in a paradox. Okay, so there is a book called They Say, I Say, and there's a link for that in this module right after this video. And I would recommend getting it if you don't already have it, because it just gives you a whole slew of ways to write things. You can almost put one of these passages on top of another and have your entire essay written as long as you fill in the blanks. But what this gives you, for instance, this is a whole framing for introducing quotes. As the prominent philosopher X puts it, of course, you would follow it with your quote, or according to, or X himself writes. And this is just, a whole bunch of these segments that you can incorporate and use, copy. This is how there are a few too for explaining quotes, because a lot of us don't know how to do that bottom piece of bread. So basically, this is after the quote. Basically, X is warning that the proposed solution will make the problem worse. Or you could say, in other words, X believes that. Or you could follow your quote with, in making this comment, the author urges us to, and then of course there's two more there. And you could pick whichever format you feel would best match the tone of your paper and the outro that you need to put onto that quote. Okay, so when you're working with quotes, here's 5. If you want to go broader than just those 3, here's this. I guess this might be the club sandwich, right? Okay, sorry for that metaphor. So here's 5 steps that you can take to really incorporate and integrate that quote into your essay, and so really to ground it with the reader. So here's 5 steps. First, you would use authorial action to state what the author is saying. Then you would use authorial action to introduce the quote and state the quote. Then you explain the quote by elaborating or providing examples. Then you can offer another way of seeing the issue or provide a concession to the author's point of view. And then you end with your own opinion of the essay. So that's just a nice large sandwich we have there, and we fully understand the quote and we understand what it's doing for your essay. So there's an essay right now. It's a very short one. It's on gender codes. It was written by Sonia Masak and Jack Solomon, and it was in the Signs of Life in the USA book. It's a short little thing on gender codes, but if you could read that and then try to follow this 5-step analysis of it yourself, and then you could check it against the written work that follows it as well.